Good afternoon, everybody. Trust you had a lovely lunch. To wake you up, we're going to do a panel on the future of Europe, not the future of the EU, although we will cover the EU. But I thought it would be interesting to kind of frame this as a panel on the future of Europe, the wider continent as well as the European Union. I've got a brilliant panel here to do this, and I thought what we would do is start by looking at some of the big macro issues that face European economies: immigration and the push factors of immigration, defence and security, obviously in the light of Ukraine and the attempt to build some kind of defence and industrial policy, where the EU sits vis-à-vis the US and China, particularly in the light of the recent tariffs on EVs and solar, the transition to net zero, the difficult bit, not just greening the grid, but also the consumer-facing part of that, how we put heat pumps in our home, how we make people switch to electric cars, the politics of that very difficult. The whole question of productivity and ageing. Not enough workers, too many old folk. What do we do about that? And as a corollary to that, the questions of populism. What do you do when post-industrial economies can't develop the economic growth that can create a social contract that gets buy-in from the voters? So to discuss all of that, I've got Simon Usherwood, Professor of Politics and International Studies at the Open University and a Fellow of the UK and a Changing Europe. Sonia Delesalle-Stolper, who is the Chief Foreign Editor of Libération, a very experienced French journalist on both sides of the channel, has written almost as many Brexit stories as I have over the years. On my Jannike first. Jannike, I'm going to get this wrong now. Come on, give me a break. Wachowiak.
Yes.
Not bad. Who is a researcher at the UK and a Changing Europe, who focuses on the UK-EU relations and European politics. And on my far left, Loukas Tsoukalis, Professor Loukas Tsoukalis, who is a Sciences Po professor, former advisor to European Commission presidents, and I'm not sure exactly what your title is, Professor, but with the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy, which is the sort of Greek Chatham House. What I thought I would do is we're going to chat for about half an hour, and I'm going to ask each of the panel to take one of those broad boxes that I outlined at the start and talk a little bit about whether they think over the next decade addressing those issues is going to bring the EU and Europe closer together or bring us apart. Is it going to be a centripetal or a centrifugal force? Professor Tsoukalis.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, after the end of the Cold War, many people in Europe, increasingly so, in Brussels and elsewhere, began to think of a world which was characterized by, marked by multilateral institutions, common rules, growing economic interdependence, a world in which Europe's open economies would benefit, and also a world in which the EU would exert its so-called soft power. This was the stuff that Brussels' dreams were made of for several decades. Now, dreams are turning into nightmare. War is back, both on our northern border and our southern border. The Cold War, the post-Cold War order is dead and buried. US foreign policy is becoming increasingly unpredictable, and the US as a protector of last resort is becoming also increasingly unreliable. There's growing strategic rivalry, and economic interdependence is being weaponized. So I think if I were to summarize the main challenge facing the European Union, and if I may open a parenthesis here, I'm talking about the European Union because the European Union, I fully understand that Europe is much bigger than the European Union, but the European Union is the only entity that makes a substantial difference in the way European countries interact with each other, and even more so the way they interact with the rest of the world. So, close parenthesis, I think the main challenge for the European Union consists of two things. One is to add a security dimension to what has been forever a peace project, namely a project of peace and reconciliation between European countries, inward-looking essentially, and relying on the United States as our protector of last resort. And the second bit of the challenge is to engage in industrial policy, as opposed to simply engaging in liberal free trade. And those two things essentially require a reprogramming of Brussels' DNA, which is easier said than done.
Loukas, in this old saying, isn't there, never waste a good crisis. And if you think of the migration crisis, the 2015 Euro crisis, indeed COVID, when we talk about greater debt mutualization in Europe, do you think that the war in Ukraine, to your point about the security dimension, can finally get us over this hump? I mean, PESCO has always been nothing but a joke, right? There's always been, 25 different types of tank and 15 different types of rifle, and we've got 2 advanced fighter programs in Europe. Do you think, thinking about the security dimension and this centrifugal v centripetal, do you think that actually Ukraine can create some kind of cohesive defense industrial policy in Europe?
It's going to be difficult, but if I may answer in a provocative way, I'm not sure whether Mr. Putin is going to be a more powerful unifier of Europe than Mr. Trump, number 2.
That's an interesting thought. We may come back to that, and we'll come back to that. Right, Sonia.
Well, how could I begin to talk about all those issues? But maybe I think one of the main probably challenge for Europe within the next decade is going to be to fight or find a way to talk and diminish that wave of populism which we're seeing everywhere. I mean, I'm talking about France, of course, because you might be aware that we are in a little bit of a chaotic situation, which reminds me a lot of the situation in this country not so long ago. And I think partly, I mean, there are many, we need to have, I think, politicians and everyone and researchers who identify the reasons for those rise in populism, which I think is partly maybe linked to the time going, which means that basically the memories of the war and the bigger challenge are dying with the last witnesses of that. And if you look at Europe and maybe more at the EU, it's never better than in time of crisis, where it finds a solution, because faced by, I mean, we saw it during COVID, we saw it with Ukraine recently, and basically when we're faced with something really, really challenging, not our day-to-day life, but really challenging, then there is a solution. So, and on top of it, we have all those, we haven't talked, I think, a lot about that this morning, but the other war going on, which is not just the war in Ukraine, it's all those cyber proxy war, which are really, I mean, very, very present in our countries. And there are ways of fighting them, but it's very difficult because, of course, it's in the shadow. And I think we need to have a proper target on that populism.
We were talking before we went live, weren't we, about how we've had 8 years of very unstable and politically chaotic government in this country, and if the polls are anything like correct, those people who are responsible for that are likely about to be roundly ejected from government. We've been looking across the channel the last 7-8 years at your ENARC president, centre-left, technocratic, etc., and yet there seems to be incredibly deep levels of disgruntlement among French voters with their system. Why have we got a similar result from 2 very different, your similar output from two very different inputs. And what do you think that tells us about the problems facing France, but also more broadly, the problems facing Europe when it's trying to deal with essentially the failure of government to deliver rising incomes, affordable housing, etc., etc.?
I think the reasons are quite similar. I mean, at the time, I remember, I think it was Annan, actually, who said that. I remember very clearly. I woke him up then. When he said something like, actually, the reasons for the will of voting Brexit and trying that thing which had never been tried before was mainly not because of the big issues, but more about having a bus who's never been installed between, you know, the outskirts of Manchester and Manchester Centre. And I think in France it's exactly the same. You had, I'm sure you're aware of, we had the Gilets jaunes in France, which was a lot about basically trying to get a more green economy, but to the expense of people in the countryside who need their car to go to work. And it led to a huge outpour of unrest. And I think that goes with that. I think those énarques, as you say, the big issues and the big move about Ukraine or about the big issues, they act and there are some initiatives and everything, but there is that feeling of being left out or left behind, or that basically, that feeling of being not taken into account in the big picture.
Jannike, I don't know what you want to go. One of the things that it seems to me is that we talk about these big macro challenges, but actually what's driving a lot of the populism, isn't it, are these really local things about the price of gas, the kind of Macron saying, let them eat cake, you know, can they really not afford to put a bit more petrol in their camionette? Well, no, they can't. How do you see it panning out?
Thank you, Peter. I think I want to take the European Parliament elections last weekend as a starting point and think a bit about what those elections tell us. And I think they really point towards fragmentation and polarization. And obviously the kind of main headline story ahead of the elections was the potential rise of the far right. And I'm sure we're going to kind of discuss far-right parties later. It's much more kind of a cementing of existing trends rather than a surge, I would say. But I think what I was struck by and what I'd like to discuss a little bit is the shrinking of the middle ground. Because if you look at the centrist parties, so the center-right and the center-left, the EPP and the SD groups in the European Parliament, and how they've developed over the last 15 years or so, the center-right has lost almost 100 MEPs since the 2009 to 2014 legislative cycle. SD has lost over 50 MEPs. SD and EPP used to be able to form a majority in the European Parliament without the Liberals. Since 2019, they've needed the Liberals. Now, even with the Liberals, it's starting to become narrower and narrower. So I think, we are in a situation where it is more fragmented. And we're also seeing kind of mixed signals coming out of the 27 member states. So obviously there is, when you look at the European Parliament elections, you have elections in 27 countries. And when you look to some of the issues that could be more divisive in the coming years, like green and climate issues, for example, you really see a very mixed picture. I mean, in Germany and in France, the Greens lost massively. In other countries in the Nordics, they were quite successful. They came first in Denmark and were successful in the Nordics overall. So you see really mixed signals, and I think this is going to be one of the issues where the position of the center-right in this European Parliament is going to be really crucial. And you can, if you look at the manifestos, you can see quite a bit of overlap in what the center-right and the European Conservatives and Reformists, so Meloni's political group in the European Parliament, are saying in terms of maybe watering down some of the things that have already decided, like the 2035 ban of the combustion engine, which is something that Manfred Weber, immediately after the European Parliament elections, came out and said, oh, actually, we don't want that anymore. We don't want bans, and that's something that Meloni's group also says in their manifesto. I think there's going to be a lot of discussion around greening of agricultural policies. And of course, well, you have regulated now, you have the Green Deal, so it's kind of baked in a way, but you still have to implement it. And I think that's going to be quite divisive, and it will also require money. And so I think that's going to be one of the issues where we're going to see a lot of kind of fragmentation and polarization in the next 5 to 10 years.
Is it, I mean, because the sort of broad narrative of the coverage of the European elections was that the sort of centre held mostly. Is it your presumption that von der Leyen will be the next Commission President? And if it is, to what extent do you think that the forces that you've just outlined will make her Commission look different than it otherwise might have been, taking into account, you know, the pressures, as you say, the retail side of the green agenda is really tricky?
Yeah, I do still think that von der Leyen is going to be the next Commission President. Obviously, they were unable to come to a conclusion at their informal dinner last night. But I think, first of all, there's probably a lack of a credible alternative candidate. Macron is distracted by what's happening domestically in France, so he might not kind of have the capacity to come up with a surprise. So I think it is likely that it's going to be von der Leyen, and I think last night what kind of crystallized as well was that there is no real opposition to the names that are on the table in principle, but I think it is more about getting concessions and shaping the policy agenda for the next 5 years, and that there are some questions around what a new von der Leyen Commission would stand for, but also what other posts like Kaja Kallas as a high representative would stand for, whether she's too focused on Russia and Ukraine. So I think that's kind of why we haven't seen a decision yet.
Do you think that agenda, so one of the things you see in one of the funny things about populism is that it makes, it's obviously sort of simplistic answers to complicated questions, but one of the outputs of it is weirdly, paradoxically, incrementalism. It's actually kind of lack of ambition, because everyone's triangulating, not trying to... Do you think, when we talk about the future of Europe, do you think the next Commission is going to be ambitious, or is it, or will its ambitions be thwarted by this fragmentation that you allude to?
I guess it depends on what kinds of ambitions you're looking for. I think what we're seeing increasingly in this European Parliament is that actually the centre-right and to some extent the centre-left have started to use the same framing as far-right parties when they talk about migration and green issues. So I think it isn't just about how strong the far right is, but also their impact on the centre. And I think that is going to influence the priorities in the new Commission, and there's going to be more focus on topics like defence and competitiveness rather than green issues.
Interesting. Simon.
And really just to kind of pick up on what the other panellists have been saying, the post-war European project to a large extent was grounded in a prosperity model, that you could enrich your way through the problems, the differences, that if everyone generally felt that life was getting better, that was a balm to the tensions that existed in the situation as it existed. And as we've come out of the Cold War, as we've come out of the demographic boom of that post-war period, that's become more difficult. So we see a structural slowing of growth across Europe, just as we have here in the UK, which makes it that much more difficult to smooth over the edges. Now, you might make an argument that the Green Deal, the green transition more generally, provides a new opportunity for economic stimulus, that Europe is relatively well positioned for green technologies and for making money out of selling those around the world, potentially. But still, it's not the same situation that it was. And so there is this question that I think in different ways all three of the other panelists have talked about, that you might be able to work around specific problems and issues, but at some point you come to a bit of a crunch and a question about whether you need to revisit the whole way in which Europe as a whole has positioned itself. And just to take some examples, the question about immigration, which is a growing issue across Europe, creates issues of division, as you were saying when we were talking at lunch, you know, north, south, east, west, transition, reception states, all of those kind of problems. But they are actually all potentially in need of more immigration in order to sustain the kind of economic model that they have at the moment. And that the political and social discussion about that need is not really there. I mean, most obviously in Central Eastern Europe, we have a very visceral objection to the arrival of immigrants, you know, and it's sort of framed in several cases as sort of a civilizational challenge. Those are countries where, perhaps even more than most, you have depopulation and you have insufficient economic activity to support an aging population. So I think we are at a point where we have to think about the way in which Europe finds itself faced by common challenges. And as much as there is, if you might say, a narcissism of small differences, actually Europe finds itself in the same boat. And that, you know, that's as true for the UK as part of Europe as it is for any of the other continental states. So, you know, everyone's facing the challenge of climate change, the geopolitical situation that you mentioned earlier, which pushes us towards working together to find common solutions, but it's difficult and there will be losers as well as winners. And I think the political class doesn't find itself in a position in any country where it feels confident that it can make that sell. You know, think about that G7 meeting we had in Puglia last week, where I think it was only Meloni who looked like she was vaguely enjoying her job at the time. You know, other people looked rather miserable, other people looked like they were lost. You know, all of those kind of things. You know, I think that's emblematic of where we are, that there are difficult and fundamental decisions to be made or discussions to be had, but the people, who are the people who are actually in a position to lead and shape that debate?
It's difficult, isn't it? You know, politicians seem to have lost. Bill Clinton used to say, you know, sometimes politicians need to take people to places that they don't yet know they need to go. And modern politicians, or politicians in the era of social media and low growth, have given up making arguments to people. Even in this country where the polls show, you know, Keir Starmer is literally going to sleepwalk his way into number 10, no one's making arguments about migration and the role that migration needs to play in social care or whatever it might be. I don't want this panel to become a sort of a laundry list of all the reasons why we're screwed. Or technical phrase. Technical phrase. So I am going to push you a little bit, and I'm going to start with you, Loukas, to tell us what might pull us out of this sort of slough of despond. What can catalyse change? What should we be shooting for so that we're not just in an exercise in hand-wringing?
Well, I mean, let us be practical. Let's look what happened in the last 30 years or so. Whenever European integration moved forward, it was always the French and the Germans who agreed and then pulled the rest behind them. And this is very unlikely to happen in the foreseeable future. We spoke, let's say, about European Parliament elections. The good news is that it doesn't look dramatically different from the previous European Parliament. In what do I mean by that? There's been, of course, a rise of the far right and nationalists at the expense mostly of the liberals and the Greens, but the old consensual majority consisting of the center-right, the socialists and the liberals is still there, and it has a big majority. This is the good news. The bad news stems from the fact that in the European Union we are all equal, but some are a bit more equal than others. And some countries count more than others. Now, the big event of the European Parliament elections was not the European Parliament elections, it was what happened in France. So if you are going to end up with a France that becomes increasingly ungovernable or governed by Mr. Bardella and his lot, this is going to have huge effect on the rest of the European Union. And if you add that, if you add to this the fact that the coalition government in Berlin is extremely weak, and nobody hears exactly what Germany wants to do with the European Union. So if you combine an ungovernable France and a very low-key Germany, which is becoming increasingly inward-looking because it's difficult to keep the coalition together, who the hell is going to lead the European Union? Nobody. Mrs. Meloni?
It's a negative answer to my question.
Yes, it is, but, you know, I'm trying to give you a realistic answer. And Mrs. Meloni can even get much worse than she is today if Trump comes to power. Because if Trump comes to power in Washington, D.C., he will unleash instincts and desires in several European leaders that they are under control today.
Do you not think that Meloni is an interesting case in point where, you know, we were saying, you know, when I was reporting Italian elections, you'd go to northern Italy and people would say, you're so damn lucky you didn't join the euro, we'd quit Europe. You know, there is a kind of constraint there. You know, Italian pensions, you know, the ECB essentially sets guardrails that even Giorgia Meloni can't, you know, there is a kind of structure there. And even if the Franco-German motor is only, you know, functioning on one cylinder, there is a structure
half a
there,
cylinder.
Half a cylinder. There is a structure there that does. Isn't that what we saw in 2016 in Trump 1? That actually, or do you think it'll be different this time?
Well, from what I understand, Trump 2 will be much different from Trump 1. First of all, because he knows, he has prepared the ground. Heritage Foundation has given him a long list of the things to do, and if you go through that list, it's terrifying about American democracy.
But would it
among
land
other
differently
things.
in Europe, in your view?
So,
last time, in some ways, it had the opposite effect, didn't it? It forced Europe together.
Sure.
Actually.
But, I mean, if Trump comes back to power, people like Orban, Meloni, Le Pen, and others will feel much freer to express themselves and their desires than they have been so far, because they've been under the control of the European structure and the checks and balances within their own countries. So it will get worse, of course. I mean, we can't take a Trump election for granted, but there is at least a 50% chance at the present moment.
And there must be a danger that the US... I interviewed Viktor Orban the day that Donald Trump got elected the first time in London. He was over the moon. He was so excited. What a day, he kept saying. His officials kept saying, you know, come on, Prime Minister, we need to go to the plane. I'm talking, what a day, you know. And actually then he was quite disappointed that, you know, the State Department, he thought Air Force One was landing in Budapest in, you know, 2 days' time. And it was slightly disappointed. And I do wonder whether the US system actually will be, you know, who constrained Trump will not do so this time.
Well, I can give you one example. I'm told, because the former US ambassador to the EU at the time when Trump came to power was a former student of mine. And he told me that one of the first things that advisors of Trump did was to phone Brussels and ask who is next after the UK to leave. And that was not only asking for their likely event, but also expressing their desire. So if Trump felt like that in 2016, it's going to be a revengeful Trump nowadays.
Yeah. Sonia, do you agree, is France ungovernable?
Of course not. I'm going to be a bit optimistic here. First of all, the election, we still have 13 days, which is a very long time, until the election. No, I wanted to say there are two things. First, what Loukas was saying about the result of the elections, of the European elections. Yes, it's not good, there is a raise of the far right. But if you look even in France, the result of the Rassemblement National was absolutely conform to what we were expecting with the polls. So it wasn't more, it was just exactly, or even a tiny bit less. We had a raise of the Place Publique, which is the Social Democrat, actually, which came nearly beat Macron's Renew Renaissance group. So the center is not completely disappearing. And if you look at the balance of power in the European Parliament, actually it's not going to change that much. Exactly what you were saying, Loukas. And the far right is going to be annoying, yes, could block some stuff, but not everything. And basically it's going to work the same thing. And if you look more widely in Europe, if you look at the European elections or the elections, the recent elections, you can see that Portugal and Spain didn't have a huge race in far right. And there are countries where they have quite a lot of immigration, and those problems are there. Poland is now with a new, more centrist government, and the PiS is now not as powerful as it used to be. Orban is more and more within Hungary contested by, okay, one of his former allies, but still he's not, he hasn't got any more that kind of position of uncontested in his country. So I think there are bits and bobs here and there that we can look to in a positive way. Looking at France, of course, if we get, I mean, there are several scenarios, but the worst would be, of course, having the Rassemblement National getting a whole majority. That would be a real, I mean, it will be a real upset, not only because France would become, I mean, I can't even contemplate that idea. It's quite difficult to even imagine that. But if it was that, basically, in Europe, it would be, I mean, even if Macron would still sit and have the power at the Conseil de l'Europe, but actually, minister from Rassemblement National could have a vote, and the National Assembly, the Parliament, would have to vote the European budget and everything. So it could be a huge problem. We could have as well a hung parliament with basically no majority anywhere, and that's going to be complicated because probably none of the group will want to work together. So that would mean we'll have as well probably a year of uncertainty. But we still don't know. We have an electoral system which could, with 2 rounds, which could make a huge difference. So we'll see, and I don't know if we're already there in terms of gloomy and horrible prognosis. As for Trump, I think there is that thing as well which I remember very clearly being here a correspondent just before the referendum, the Brexit referendum. No, sorry, just before the presidential election, the first one in France, for Macron, so 2017. And people were telling me, well, we had Trump, we had Brexit, so of course you're going to have Marine Le Pen in France because it's a movement and it's populism raising everywhere. We didn't. And I think there is no necessarily, and I think as well, if you look at the far-right Meloni, but even the Rassemblement National, who was for Brexit, for coming out of Euro, they all changed their minds thanks to Britain, I have to say. No, but it's true. They saw that Brexit result is not overwhelmingly positive, let's say.
That's the understatement of the year.
No, but that means that actually it's not even an issue right now, and they all very careful, and even the one voting, and the more, you don't find many people in the countryside saying, oh yeah, I'm for Brexit. And
but
Sonia,
it has changed. You do your best to paint a kind of glass half full.
I'm trying to be optimistic.
Right, yeah. But glass half full, Franco-German motor, where, 1 cylinder, half a cylinder, 2 cylinders, whatever, given and Jannike's description of where we are, Parliament, and we're thinking about the future of Europe, how do we think Europe is going to address these kind of collective challenges? Is that the wrong question to be asking, actually? Is it completely unrealistic to think that we can come together and have a joint, even though Putin menaces our borders in the east? We're still fighting over how an EU European defence industrial policy. We'll see where the Brits fit into that. Do we need to go backwards to go forward? Do we need to step back on the green stuff in order to create a kind of political cohesiveness to try and drive consensus on things like migration? I mean,
I think, and I think there is, but the expert from the European Union would be better placed to talk about that. But I think there is the realization that the changes are going too quickly, partly, and the directive and new regulations, and there had been too many regulations too quickly. And people have got difficulties to, companies, have got difficulties to adjust to those changes. So there is a recognition that probably you need to go to a bit of a slower path, even looking at the emergency of climate change and everything. But to go back to just the Franco-German, and I will be short on that, Franco-German engine, or whatever you call it, Macron and Scholz don't like each other. They are two complete opposite personalities. Macron is very pushy, as you've seen that last Sunday, and Scholz is very much, as Merkel was a little bit, kind of waiting to see and reacting just in front of a crisis, but not being at the initiative of a new change or something like that. So it hasn't worked well. But if you look over the last probably months or something like that, there is clearly an effort to show a better kind of
united front.
Exactly. Even last night at the dinner, you saw that Scholz and Macron were very much on the same page, pushing to, get the top jobs to basically show a sense of stability in an unstable Europe.
Yeah. Jannike, do you hear anything that cheers you up there? There was a piece in The Economist just recently, dreadful magazine that it is, don't recommend it, saying that peak Europe was 1999, which was when Milosevic was prevented from committing genocide, and there was a sense that history was ended and all the rest of it. And here we are, 25 years later, really wringing our hands over the kind of intractability of the challenges that face us, and the sort of sense really that Europe's lost its mojo, Europe's lost its place in the world, even its soft power status, its status as a trade regulator and as a trade behemoth. Do you see a way in which we get that mojo back? I use "we" in the broadest sense of the word there.
I think it's very difficult to put a positive spin on it, but I think if you look at kind of what's happened in the EU and how it has changed over the last 10 or 15 years, it's really been driven by crises and by how the EU has responded to crises, and there's been no lack of crisis, that's for sure. And I think that is probably going to remain the case. So rather than kind of expecting kind of the EU as a construct of 27 different countries to kind of take a very forward-looking strategic approach in some areas, even though that might be desirable, I think it is still going to be driven by crises. I guess maybe the positive spin would be that if you look at how the EU has acted or responded to COVID, but also the war in Ukraine, that they've been able to do things that previously were considered unthinkable. I mean, just the fact that you have Next Generation EU and that the European Union, even though it was very difficult, but in the end they were able to come to a decision to jointly borrow to finance the recovery from the pandemic. And even a country like Germany agreed to that, which probably if you had suggested something like that, like even 5 years ago, everyone would have said, well, no way. And if you look at how they've responded to, well, they also jointly purchased vaccines during the pandemic. If you look how they responded to Ukraine, the CSDP, kind of foreign security and defense policy, even though it is still largely driven by member states, we have seen some deeper integration in this area. You've also seen the joint purchasing of ammunition for Ukraine, which would have been unthinkable. So there are some things that happened which are unprecedented in a way and very much driven by crises. And even though it's been very difficult, they were able to come to a conclusion on those areas. But I guess the problem is that they always only seem to be able to do so when it's like almost too late.
Simon, I'm going to throw this one at you. Do you think that bearing in mind what Jannike is saying, that, you know, when confronted by a crisis, the European Union we're talking about here actually, you know, just about manages to kind of come up with a mutual program on COVID recovery, etc. Given the tension, I mean, you know, which Brexit is writ large, between the centre and the European Union construct and nationalist, populist movements all across Europe, is the European Union the kind of right vehicle, given all the baggage that it carries? Is it the right vehicle? I mean, Loukas said it was the only vehicle, but when you look at the defence cooperation, you know, you have NATO, you have the G7. You could see a European, not EU, but a European defence industrial cooperation movement, for example, that included the Brits outside the EU. Should we be looking for outside the EU box when it comes to trying to address some of these things? Or is that...
Well, let's start with the first point, which is this just-in-time model of politics. Show me a political system anywhere in the world that doesn't operate on a just-in-time basis. The only example I could think of off the top of my head was the Norwegians being very sensible with their oil money, but who wants to be like Norway? So, you know, I think that's part of the condition of a democratic politics where there are lots of different interests, and, you know, it's writ large in a European context because we've got that additional level. I think my slightly hedgy answer is that the EU is the most important game in town, but it's not the only game in town. And I think one of the great strengths of Europe, in that sense, is that there's a laboratory of experimentation. Let's think about Ukraine. We very rapidly inflated new instruments, new systems of cooperation, alongside existing institutionalized, boring, old-fashioned bodies in order to address that situation. Now, that has worked to a considerable extent. It hasn't worked perfectly by any extent, but it points to the fact that just in security, but also more generally, there's a lot going on in Europe. You know, let's think about here in the UK. We're about to have a centre-left government be elected, which is going to have a more internationalist kind of perspective than its predecessor, certainly more Europeanist kind of perspective. There are some ideas that will come out of that. There's going to be some exploration of different kinds of ways of working together. And I think, you know, if you want to come back to your desire for some positivity, you know, I think that's where it comes. It's not that we have to keep on trying the same thing again and again and hoping that one day it sticks. It's that there is a lot of flexibility, and that's the way that European cooperation
works in the real world.
Has worked in the real world. You know, that we've run up against the buffers of something, and then we've gone around and we found a different kind of way. You know, security is the classic example. We've tried one thing, then we tried another, then we tried 4 other things, and then we went back to one of the things we tried before, which didn't work. Yeah. So I think that there's opportunity. I think that the danger, and I think it's somewhat that's implicit in what everyone's saying here, is that there is a danger in complacency. That if you rely on the status quo, you know, if you rely on Euro membership to stop other countries leaving the EU, at some point you're going to come unstuck. You know, just as in the UK, the government was complacent that just people would think it was too much hassle to leave the EU, that would somehow tip the result. Well, here we are, with our glorious careers keeping us all busy. But again, I think that's the danger, is a complacency issue in politics, and so then it's about recognizing opportunities and having people who are willing to make the effort, make the push.
Yeah. Right, we're going to do 15 minutes of questions. There are mics in the room. Please ask questions, don't make speeches, and please tell us who you are and where you are from. And because he runs the place and owns the place, I'm going to go straight to Professor Menon.
Thanks. I've just got a quick comment and then a question to Loukas. The comment is on what Simon just said. He's absolutely spot on. I mean, it was very nice of us to leave the European Union because the mean way to do it would have been to stay in and just stop obeying the law. You know, that would have been the nightmare solution. We'd stayed in and said, you know what, we'll just pick the rules we want to follow and what you're going to do about it. So leaving was a lot neater. The real problem is you get a very Eurosceptic government that stays in, then you've got problems. And on what Loukas was saying about a peace project, I found it interesting because isn't there a fundamental tension in turning a peace project into a power project? Because the whole point of a peace project is to constrain power. And the EU is built on a system of disproportionate weight for the small member states, the large member states not being able to lead in the way that they might be used to. And to be a power project, you can't be vetoed by Luxembourg. So you're going to have to rethink the entire DNA of the EU, and it was that DNA that allowed so many member states to sign up in the first place.
Loukas, hold that in your capacious brain for 1 second, because I'm going to add in a question from Slido from Dan Beck, who says, is there any mileage in associate membership, e.g. for reluctant or aspirant members?
Okay. Now, I said before that shifting from a peace project to a power project, or adding security dimension, one, and moving from free trade to industrial policy requires a reprogramming of the Brussels DNA. And that's extremely difficult. But that's really the challenge, because the whole European integration has been based on liberal economic thinking and leaving security aside and free riding of the United States as far as security is concerned. Now, both of those options are no longer viable because economic interdependence is being weaponized. It's not only the Chinese, the Americans are resorting more and more to industrial policy. So we have to change our economic approach to the way we integrate. And we also have to change our approach regarding security because, I mean, with wars near your border, with a revanchist Russia, and with the United States, and I insist on this, becoming increasingly not only unpredictable, but unreliable as a security provider. And if you want, let me add one other dimension. The US, irrespective of who is in power, has decided that China constitutes a huge strategic threat for US interests or US hegemony. You choose which one of the two you want to use. Now, European interests are not necessarily the same with those of the United States. The Europeans have much more open economies, collectively, not to mention individually, than the Americans. The Europeans cannot afford to move to an increasingly protectionist world relying on unilateral economic decisions. So there is bound to be tension between the two sides of the Atlantic regarding the way we handle China. So your transatlantic relationship becomes more complicated. For all those reasons, Europe has to think in terms of power. Can it do it or can it not? Can it do it? Now, and let me come back, and that will be my last word on this. I mean, if we take the long term of European integration, you know, we had many successes and failures, you had ups and downs and all the rest, but it is true that over the long term, there's been a remarkable and continuous expansion in terms of functions and membership, which is a sure sign of success, right? Now, nowadays, it's not only that the world has changed dramatically, and we have to operate in a very different world, but there's something else, and I mentioned it in the beginning. France that becomes increasingly un-European or ungovernable is a huge structural problem inside the European Union. You cannot afford that sort of thing. France is not like any other member country. So if France has a combination of Bardella or Mélenchon or simply has a hanged parliament, what kind of European policy will Paris follow? And if there is no European policy from France, who is going to run European policy? Meloni? So that's why I'm really worried, and I keep on going back to France.
It's all your fault. Right.
Yeah, as always.
Our next question. Right at the back.
Hi, I'm Mark English from European Movement UK. My question is, how does the panel see the future of EU enlargement, notably but not only to Ukraine? And secondly, how might that affect the relationship with the UK and the possibilities for more flexibility on that?
Jannike, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure.
But not too much Brexit, because I think we've done a whole morning of Brexit, so not too much Brexit.
Okay, I'll try my best. Talking about Brexit is in my DNA, though, unfortunately, so it's going to be tricky.
Let's have some Brexit. Why not? We love it.
So enlargement. Well, I think it's going to be extremely tricky. I think a lot of kind of implicit promises have been made. But it's not entirely clear to me how the EU is going to keep those. It's obviously now being seen as a kind of geopolitical project enlargement. But I think the problem is that the way that the system works at the moment and the requirement for unanimity at so many different stages of the process just means that individual member states can veto the process at so many different points, and we know that there are member states that are opposed to enlargement towards Ukraine, but also some other countries, Hungary being the prime example. But also if we look at what's happening nationally in other member states with general elections in Austria later this year, where we expect the FPÖ to come out as the strongest party, they've already said that they are opposed to enlargement towards Ukraine as well. So the more veto players you have within the system, the more difficult it gets.
So is enlargement really an idea rather than a reality? I mean, do we ever think that the Ukraine, the Balkans, never anyone's going to actually let them join? But this idea about sort of peripheral concentric circles sort of continues to exist out there and becomes useful in some way, or is it just a kind of permanent fiction?
It's really difficult to say. I mean, I think it's also going to be driven again by external factors and crises, because it is a geopolitical and a security question for Europe as well. So depending on what happens in the relationship with the US, but also what happens with Russia, I think will drive progress or not in the enlargement process. I think when it comes to kind of this idea of concentric circles, we're already seeing a movement towards kind of gradual integration and kind of opening the single market to some of those countries. I think that might well happen, even though it's also difficult and it will come with obligations. What I don't see is that it's going to change the relationship that the EU has with the UK, because it's a completely different purpose and endpoint. If you open your internal market gradually to future member states, it's just a completely different story to the UK as a non-member that has no intention of rejoining.
Yeah. Right. Yes, madam, in the front.
Just in regard to elections in European countries altogether and elsewhere, nobody has mentioned the role of misrepresentation in social media. I did read a number of times that the right vote came to a large extent, surprisingly, from the younger age group. I think in France, the potential prime minister has a huge following on TikTok. Isn't that a reasonably easy aspect of a pre-election to counter? And why isn't more of it being done?
Sonia, you're the journalist.
You mean to counter in terms of...
So somebody's telling the truth also.
Well, it goes back to what I was saying about cyber war and trying to fight disinformation, which is a real problem for journalists, for everyone, for politicians, for everyone. Now you see, I mean, you're right about Bardella and his young followers. You have to notice right now, because we're in the middle of a very quick and sudden and short campaign, that actually you've got quite a lot of sportsmen, artists, I mean, people who usually are quite careful about giving their thoughts before an election, who are now using as well TikTok or other social media to basically to say go and vote and don't vote for the extreme. Basically, that's the main message. I mean, you had a little fight around the. Anna wanted to speak about the Euro football competition, and you had a little discussion about should the French team express their feelings or not, and someone said no, they shouldn't, but actually they did. I mean, not all of them, but the main players, Mbappé and everything. Yeah. And so I think it's something that we can't now neglect, and we need to be extremely aware of that. Now, does it make a real difference? I don't know. I have to say I'm not completely sure. And it was, but you look today, I mean, we talk as if, I mean, I think the result of the election is, on this side of the channel, looks more settled than the one in France, but on the 4th of July. But the fact is, you see Nigel Farage, who was prominent during the first campaign for Brexit, is now again prominent for other reasons, but he's still very present in the, actually, as well, the traditional media.
Yeah. I mean, the challenge with social media is, you know, the paradox is the more you challenge something, often the more you reinforce it. You know, the 350 million, the 2,000, you know, speaking as, you know, a journalist who spends his life throwing facts and see if any stick at the wall, it can be a pretty thankless and counterintuitive process. It's close to custom cream time, but we've got time for a couple more. I'm going to take 2 questions in a row. So this gentleman here in the blue shirt had a hand up very early. Yes. And then...
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the notions of enlargement and associate membership. We talked about staircases earlier on. We also talked about cherry picking earlier on. I wanted to ask, in terms of things like associate membership staircases, there are different people who are picking different cherries. So there are the people who, like the UK, was trying to pick cherries, but there would also seem to be Europe who might be picking cherries in terms of what kind of things it wants to associate with, what kinds of concentric circle, or who gets up where on the staircase. So I'd like to bring back cherry picking again.
You may not be alone in that. And we'll take a double header. So the gentleman over there with the shirt and the beard.
Hello, I'm Dominic Hart, King's College student. My question is about security. So we touched on whether or not the EU is the right vehicle for supporting a kind of more integrated European defence posture. I'm just wondering what you think the tensions with NATO and the wider kind of situation with PESCO, and whether or not actually that forum will sustain itself in the current model, or whether or not there's going to have to be a rejuvenation of the kind of military structure there.
A European military structure or NATO military structure?
No, so whether we need to move away from the present structure with PESCO and kind of rejuvenate the process.
Okay, so a question on cherry picking, and I was struck, for example, when the Commission asked for a mandate on youth mobility. This is semi-Brexit, but what was interesting was actually how much of what was in there would have been considered cherry picking in the 2016 to 2020 period. You know, by definition, in some ways, we've moved on. Loukas, do you want to take the cherry picking one? Is the enlargement agenda going to lead to more flexibility? Is Jannike right that if you're on the way out, you get a different gig than on the way in, or do you think there will be flex on that? And then we'll go to a PESCO question.
Now, on enlargement, I mean, if we want to be honest with ourselves, we know that the EU is not ready to enlarge, and we also know that none of the candidate countries will be ready to join and fulfill the criteria in the foreseeable future. So what do? There are geopolitical reasons that force you to try to accelerate the process, but the conditions are not there. So I think the approach that is likely to be adopted, is already being adopted, is on the one hand, you insist on reforms on both sides, including reforms in the European Union. For example, there's no way we're going to continue with unanimity in foreign policy if we're going to enlarge from 27, which is already impossible, to 35. So you cannot allow any Orban of this world to keep the rest of the operation hostage. That's number one. Second, we will be talking in terms of phased integration. So it's not a question of either outside or full member, but it's going to be a long process in which you are gradually integrated in different sectors, in different parts of the machine. And I think the last point is that we're likely to end up with an even more differentiated European Union.
And
internally differentiated
And in
Europe.
a yes or no answer, does that provide a template docking station paradigm that the UK can use in the next decade?
I should hope so.
Okay. Simon, PESCO.
I'm going to tie together the cherries and the PESCO thing, which is to say that if you're in a strong enough position, then you can pick cherries. But I think in the case of the military cooperation, I think the issue is again, as I was saying earlier about Ukraine, defense situations tend to be case-specific. And so what works for one case doesn't necessarily work for another. So, there's a question about NATO and its ability to adapt to changing security threats over the Cold War, post-Cold War period. So I think in the case of PESCO, I think it does some useful things, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it does everything that's useful. And so I think there is space, again, for growing your own cherry tree, to come back to that kind of language, where you can let other people gain benefits in a way that ties them in. And again, I think we've got to stop thinking it's that differentiation point that Loukas just made, which is there's more than one way to tackle these things. And the more ways we create, the more opportunities we create for people to find value, to have a sell that they can take back to populations and voters, which potentially then provides a basis for a re-engagement of those voters with elites, which is as close as you're going to get to a positive conclusion. So
I love it. Right. It's time for a cup of tea. We might be talking about the future of Europe, but we're still in Blighty. Please come back in half an hour for the last panel, which is the future of the UK. And give our panel a round of applause.